Imagine standing in what you think is a safe position, 5 kilometers behind the front lines, unloading ammunition at a railway station. Your officers assured you the Soviet artillery couldn't reach this far. Then you hear it, a sound unlike anything in military history. Not the whistle of traditional artillery shells, but a screaming, howling noise that builds like 48 demons tearing through the sky simultaneously. You have 7 seconds before your world ends. No time to run, no time to take cover. Just enough time to realize that everything your commanders told you about Soviet technological inferiority was a catastrophic lie. This is the story of how German troops at Orsha, Belarus, encountered the most terrifying weapon they'd ever face. A weapon so secret that the NKVD executed its own soldiers rather than risk it falling into enemy hands. A weapon that would make hardened Wehrmacht veterans refuse to advance when they heard its distinctive scream. If you want to discover how one experimental Soviet battery changed the psychology of warfare on the Eastern Front forever, hit that like button, subscribe for more untold WW2 stories, drop a comment about which battle we should cover next, and let's dive into the moment when German confidence shattered under Stalin's organ. 1447 hours, July 14th, 1941. Gadichi village, 5.6 kilometers east of Orsha railway station, Smolensk Oblast. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Flyorov stands beside his BM-13 launcher, fingers running across the electrical firing mechanism one final time before giving the order that will change modern warfare forever. The launcher weighs 7,300 kilograms fully loaded, a modified ZIS-6 truck with 16 guide rails mounted at a 45-degree angle, each rail holding an M13 rocket 5.2 feet long and weighing 92 pounds. The entire system looks like something assembled in a mad scientist's laboratory rather than a Soviet weapons factory, which isn't far from the truth. Just 6 weeks ago, 5 of these 7 launchers were still development prototypes, sitting in Moscow workshops, their design so experimental that even Stalin's own artillery commanders debated whether they'd work under combat conditions. Flyorov's battery had left Moscow under absolute secrecy on July 2nd. NKVD troops accompanied them with orders written in blood. Destroy the launchers completely if capture becomes imminent. Execute any crew member who might talk if wounded and about to be taken prisoner. The weapon's existence represents such a strategic advantage that Stalin personally ordered it kept secret at any cost. Each launcher crew carries thermite charges specifically designed to melt the vehicles and firing mechanisms beyond recognition. They've been told that families back home will suffer if the Germans discover how these weapons function. The targeting mathematics run through Flyorov's head like artillery calculations, but these aren't traditional shells following predictable ballistic trajectories. Each M13 rocket carries 4.9 kilograms of high explosive propelled by solid fuel that burns for 1.5 seconds, reaching maximum velocity of 355 meters per second before the stabilizer fins deploy. Range to target, 5,600 meters, well within the weapon's maximum range of 8,500 meters. Impact area, approximately 100 meters by 80 meters. The entire railway station platform where German reconnaissance indicates a concentration of troops, ammunition trains, and fuel trucks staging for the next Wehrmacht offensive push toward Moscow.
His battery commander, Captain Ivan Flyorov, receives the fire mission directly from General Karibili, Deputy Chief of Artillery for the Western Front. The Germans are establishing a bridgehead across the Orsha River. They're consolidating supplies at Orsha Station for a major push. We need to slow them down, give our forces time to establish defensive positions on the east bank of the Dnieper. Your experimental battery is our only option for hitting that station from our current position. Flyorov understands the unspoken reality. Traditional Soviet artillery has been retreating so fast that most guns capable of reaching Orsha have already been abandoned or destroyed during the chaotic German advance. His 7 experimental launchers represent the only heavy firepower available within range. If the Katyushas fail, if the rockets malfunction or miss their targets, the German supply concentration at Orsha will fuel an armored thrust that could break the entire Soviet defensive line. The launcher crews complete their final checks. Electrical systems tested. 16 rockets per launcher, 7 launchers in the battery, total payload of 112 rockets ready to fire in a coordinated salvo. The Germans have never encountered anything like this. Their intelligence files contain no reference to Soviet multiple rocket launchers. Their tactical doctrine includes no countermeasures for weapons that saturate entire grid squares with high explosive in under 10 seconds. They're about to learn that technological surprise wins battles as decisively as superior numbers. Flyorov's thumb hovers over the firing button. His training emphasizes the weapon's primary advantage, psychological impact combined with devastating material effect. A single M13 rocket explodes with the force of a 122mm howitzer shell. But while traditional artillery fires 2 to 3 rounds per minute, the Katyusha delivers 16 rockets in 7 seconds. The sound alone, the distinctive scream of 112 rockets launching simultaneously, will create terror unlike anything the Wehrmacht has experienced. German soldiers who've endured artillery barrages throughout their advance across Poland, France, and now deep into Soviet territory are about to discover that nothing in their experience has prepared them for Stalin's organ. The fire command crackles through his headset. Battery execute. Fire mission grid 472389. Enemy troop concentration and supply depot. Fire for effect.
The sound hits first, not a traditional artillery report, but a screaming, howling noise that builds in intensity as 112 rockets ignite their solid fuel motors simultaneously. German troops at Orsha railway station, 5.6 kilometers to the west, hear the noise before they can identify the source. Obergefreiter Klaus Dietz, unloading ammunition crates from a supply train, freezes mid-motion. The sound reminds him of the Stuka dive bomber's sirens, but multiplied by 50 and coming from the wrong direction, from the ground, not the sky. His sergeant, a veteran of the Poland and France campaigns, starts to shout orders, but the words die in his throat as he spots the rocket trails. Not 1 or 2, like the Nebelwerfer rockets the German army occasionally employs, but a forest of white smoke trails arcing across the sky in a perfect pattern. The trails converge on a single point, the exact center of the railway station, where 3 companies of Wehrmacht infantry are staging ammunition, fuel trucks, and artillery pieces for tomorrow's offensive. Dietz's training screams at him to take cover, but his body won't respond. The psychological impact of watching 112 rockets approach in formation creates a paralysis that experienced combat soldiers later describe as more terrifying than facing direct tank fire. With a tank, you can shoot back. With traditional artillery, you can hear the shell coming and dive for cover. But this looks like God's judgment, rendered in fire and steel, unavoidable and absolute. The first rockets impact at 14:48 hours and 23 seconds. M13 warheads detonate with 4.9 kilograms of high explosive each, creating blast waves that overlap and reinforce across the entire station platform. The Germans had positioned ammunition trains in what they thought was a safe rear area staging point, beyond Soviet artillery range. Those ammunition trains explode in a chain reaction that turns the railway station into something resembling a volcano erupting upward rather than outward. German combat engineers later estimate the initial rocket salvo delivered the explosive equivalent of 548 kilograms of TNT across an area roughly 100 meters by 80 meters in 7 seconds. For comparison, a sustained barrage from a traditional 122mm howitzer battery firing for 5 minutes would deliver approximately the same payload, giving defenders time to seek cover, organize counter-battery fire, and minimize casualties. The Katyusha's concentrated salvo gives none of those options.
Soldiers caught in the open simply cease to exist. Those near the blast zone die from overpressure that ruptures internal organs before the shrapnel arrives. The lucky ones never know what killed them.
Obergefreite Dietz regains consciousness 40 meters from where he'd been standing, his uniform smoldering, his ears bleeding from burst eardrums. The railway station has vanished. Where 3 companies' worth of supplies and equipment had been organized in neat military efficiency, nothing remains but scattered debris and secondary explosions as fuel trucks and ammunition stores continue detonating. He counts bodies, or what's left of bodies, scattered across the impact area. 73 men in his immediate field of view, most killed by the blast effect rather than shrapnel. The physical casualties are catastrophic, but worse is the psychological impact rippling through surviving German troops. At 16:45 a.m., while German commanders at Orsha are still trying to understand what happened to their railway station, Flyorov's battery fires again. This time, the target is the German bridgehead across the Orsha River, where Wehrmacht engineers have constructed pontoon bridges for armor to cross. The second salvo of 112 rockets catches German mechanized battalion in the middle of a river crossing. Tanks on the bridges, support vehicles queued on the west bank, infantry concentrated on the east bank, establishing a defensive perimeter. The rockets impact with the same devastating efficiency. The pontoon bridges collapse under the high explosive detonations, dumping tanks into the river. Infantry on both banks experience the same paralyzing terror that struck the railway station troops. That distinctive scream, followed by instantaneous saturation bombardment that offers no chance for tactical response. German after-action reports recovered months later describe the attack with language that sounds more like folklore than military analysis. The Russians possess an automatic multi-barreled flame cannon whose shots are generated by electricity. The attack creates a solid sea of fire from which escape is impossible. The psychological effect spreads through German frontline units faster than official intelligence reports. Soldiers who survived the Katyusha attacks tell stories that grow more terrifying with each retelling. The rockets that scream like banshees, the weapon that fires faster than thought, the Soviet superweapon that makes traditional military tactics obsolete. Wehrmacht commanders dismiss these accounts as battlefield hysteria, trauma responses from troops who broke under pressure. But the pattern repeats across multiple sectors. German advances falter when survivors describe encountering Stalin's organ, a nickname that emerges within 48 hours of the first attack, inspired by the launcher's visual resemblance to church organ pipes and the screaming sound of the rockets. On August 14, 1941, German High Command issues a directive that validates everything the frontline troops have been reporting. All encounters with Russian automatic multi-barrel artillery systems must be reported immediately to command level. These weapons represent a significant tactical threat requiring immediate intelligence analysis and countermeasure development. The directive's formal language can't disguise the underlying reality. The Germans are terrified of a weapon they don't understand and can't effectively counter. Flyorov's battery disappears back into the Soviet defensive positions before German counter-battery fire can locate their firing position. The Katyusha's greatest tactical advantage isn't just its firepower, it's the mobility. A traditional artillery battery requires 30-40 minutes to displace after firing, making it vulnerable to counter-battery strikes. The truck-mounted Katyushas fire their complete salvo in 7 seconds, then drive away at 60 kilometers per hour, relocating to new firing positions before German artillery observers can even identify the launch site coordinates. The psychological impact on German morale proves as significant as the material destruction. Wehrmacht troops had spent the first 3 weeks of Operation Barbarossa advancing with shocking speed, convinced of their technological and tactical superiority over the supposedly primitive Soviet forces. The Katyusha shatters that confidence. How do you maintain aggressive offensive operations when any concentration of troops or supplies might attract an instantaneous rocket barrage from an enemy you can't see, can't locate, and can't retaliate against? German soldiers begin spreading out their formations, avoiding concentrated positions, reducing the efficiency of their supply operations. Exactly the force dispersion effects that Soviet commanders hoped to achieve. By the end of July 1941, German intelligence finally pieces together a crude understanding of what they're facing. Not a superweapon powered by electricity, but a multiple rocket launcher system that exploits mass and speed over accuracy and range. But understanding the weapon doesn't reduce its terror. German troops still hear that distinctive scream and experience the same primal fear. Soviet commanders recognize they've discovered a weapon that delivers military effectiveness far beyond its actual specifications. A weapon where psychological impact multiplies material effect. August 8, 1941. Moscow Kremlin, Supreme High Command Headquarters. Stalin's thick fingers trace across tactical maps showing the chaotic German advance through Belarusia and Ukraine. Wehrmacht forces have penetrated 600 kilometers into Soviet territory in just 6 weeks, destroying entire Soviet armies in massive encirclement battles that defy traditional military mathematics. But among the catastrophic casualty reports and desperate defensive actions, one bright spot emerges from the intelligence summaries. Captain Flyorov's experimental Katyusha battery has executed 17 successful fire missions without losing a single launcher, inflicting estimated German casualties exceeding 2,000 troops and destroying critical supplies at multiple railway junctions and river crossings. Stalin issues an order that validates Soviet rocket artillery as more than an experimental technology. Form 8 Special Guards mortar regiments under direct control of the reserve of the Supreme High Command. Each regiment will comprise 3 battalions of 3 batteries, totaling 36 BM-13 or BM-8 launchers per regiment. Independent Guards mortar battalions will also be formed with 12 launchers in 3 batteries of 4. The directive transforms rocket artillery from experimental concept to strategic weapon system in a single administrative action. The production order that follows strains Soviet industrial capacity, already reeling from factory evacuations as German forces advance toward Moscow. The compressor factory in Moscow becomes the primary production facility, working 24-hour shifts to convert ZIS-6 trucks into Katyusha launchers. Each launcher requires specialized electrical firing systems, precision-manufactured guide rails, and integration with the M-13 rocket production lines, running at facilities scattered across the Soviet rear areas. By December 1941, Soviet factories deliver 554 Katyusha launchers, organized into 8 Guards regiments, 35 independent battalions, and 2 independent batteries. An industrial mobilization that prioritizes rocket artillery over traditional guns, despite the resource constraints. The organizational structure reflects rocket artillery's unique tactical role. Unlike traditional artillery brigades attached to army-level formations, the Guards mortar regiments report directly to Stavka, the Soviet Supreme High Command. This gives Soviet strategic commanders the ability to concentrate rocket artillery at critical points without waiting for requests to filter through army and front-level bureaucracy. A German breakthrough threatens a vital defensive sector? Deploy 2 Guards mortar regiments with 72 launchers to deliver coordinated saturation barrages. Enemy forces concentrate for an offensive? Hit their assembly areas with 432 rockets before they begin their advance. The tactical employment doctrines developed through bitter experience during the autumn of 1941 as German forces pushed toward Moscow. Guards mortar commanders learned that Katyusha effectiveness depends on 3 critical factors: surprise, mass, and immediate displacement after firing. A single battery firing alone gives Germans time to adjust their tactics, spread their formations, and potentially locate the launch site for counter-battery fire. But multiple batteries firing in coordinated salvos create the psychological shock effect that paralyzes enemy decision-making. Major Mikhail Malinin commands the 1st Guards mortar regiment during the Battle of Moscow in December 1941,
coordinating 36 BM-13 launchers in defensive operations that slow German advances toward the Soviet capital. His after-action reports describe Katyusha employment as psychological warfare backed by devastating material effect. The weapon's primary value is not accuracy. Individual rockets scatter across a 100-meter impact zone, but rather the simultaneous delivery of massive explosive payload that creates a kill zone where survival becomes matter of luck rather than tactical skill. German troops who survive Katyusha barrages demonstrate observable deterioration in combat effectiveness, refusing to advance across open ground, breaking formation to seek individual cover, and, in several documented cases, abandoning offensive operations entirely when they hear the distinctive rocket scream.
The psychological intelligence proves as valuable as physical battle damage assessments. Soviet interrogators systematically interviewed German prisoners, documenting their experiences with Katyusha attacks and analyzing the fear responses that transcend normal battlefield stress. One captured German lieutenant from the 7th Panzer Division describes an attack near Tula that exemplifies the weapon's psychological impact. "We heard the scream before we saw the rockets. The entire battalion froze, not from discipline, but from primal terror. Men who'd fought through Poland, France, and 3 months of Russia suddenly became paralyzed, unable to move or respond to orders. When the rockets impacted, the physical casualties were severe, but worse was what happened afterward. Soldiers refused to concentrate for tactical formations. Officers couldn't organize coherent defensive positions because men would scatter rather than cluster together. We'd lost our cohesion as a military unit, reduced to individuals focused entirely on personal survival." The Germans attempt to develop countermeasures, but the Katyusha's design exploits fundamental tactical advantages that resist conventional military responses. Traditional counter-battery doctrine relies on locating enemy artillery through sound ranging or flash spotting, then delivering precision fires that destroy the guns before they can displace. But Katyusha batteries fire for 7 seconds, then drive away at highway speeds, covering 3 to 4 kilometers before German counter-battery calculations are even complete. Soviet commanders position launchers in concealed firing points with pre-plotted displacement routes that prioritize speed over cover, fire and run, appearing and disappearing like ghosts that deliver devastating barrages, then vanish before retaliation arrives. German attempts to hunt Katyusha batteries with ground forces or aircraft similarly failed to produce significant results. The launchers look like ordinary supply trucks when not actively firing, making them nearly impossible to distinguish from regular Soviet military traffic. Even when German reconnaissance aircraft photograph suspected Katyusha positions, by the time bomber strikes can be organized, the launchers have relocated to new firing points kilometers away. The few successful German strikes against Guards mortar units typically occur when launchers are caught during reloading operations, the weapon's primary vulnerability since each launcher requires 30 to 40 minutes to manually reload all 16 guide rails with fresh rockets. By the end of 1941, the Katyusha has achieved the status that every military weapon aspires to, but few attain, becoming a psychological symbol that transcends its actual specifications. German soldiers fear Stalin's organ with an intensity that exceeds rational threat assessment. Wehrmacht tactical intelligence manuals dedicate entire sections to identifying and avoiding potential Katyusha target areas. German officers adjust their operational planning to account for Soviet rocket artillery, dispersing forces and reducing concentration even when no actual Katyusha threat exists in the sector. The weapon's nickname, Stalin's organ, achieves widespread usage in both German and Soviet military parlance, though with very different emotional connotations. Germans use the term with dark humor that barely masks genuine fear, while Soviet troops embrace it as a symbol of their technological capability and fighting spirit. Soviet propaganda exploits this extensively, featuring Katyusha launchers in newsreels, posters, and military publications that emphasize Soviet industrial power and tactical innovation.
"Our Stalin's organs play the death song for fascist invaders," becomes a common propaganda slogan, transforming a weapon system into a cultural symbol of Soviet resistance. The industrial production continues accelerating through 1941 and 1943 as Soviet factories evacuated beyond the Ural Mountains reach full operational capacity. BM-13 launchers are joined by BM-8 systems firing smaller 82mm rockets, and later by BM-31 heavy launchers delivering 300mm rockets with devastating explosive payloads. The diversification allows Soviet commanders to tailor rocket artillery employment to specific tactical situations: BM-8 for suppressing infantry positions, BM-13 for general-purpose saturation bombardment, and BM-31 for destroying fortified positions and strongpoints. Guards mortar regiments achieve elite status within the Red Army structure, receiving priority for personnel, equipment, and logistical support. Katyusha crews undergo specialized training that emphasizes rapid firing procedures, displacement tactics, and coordination with conventional artillery and air support. The regiments develop a fierce esprit de corps, viewing themselves as the Soviet answer to German tactical superiority, proof that Soviet technology and tactics can match or exceed anything the Wehrmacht brings to battle.
January 19, 1943, Voronezh Front, 60 kilometers northeast of Stalingrad. Senior Sergeant Viktor Kusenko crouches beside his BM-13 launcher in a concealed firing position dug into frozen ground that resists entrenching tools like concrete. His breath forms ice crystals in air that registers -32 degrees Celsius, cold enough to make metal weapons painful to touch with bare skin. The Guards Mortar Battalion has been positioned here for 3 days, waiting for the order that finally arrives through encrypted radio communication. Support the final Soviet offensive to complete the encirclement and destruction of the German Sixth Army trapped in Stalingrad. The tactical situation exemplifies how Katyusha employment has evolved from desperate defensive weapon to sophisticated offensive system integrated into strategic operations. General Konstantin Rokossovic's plan for crushing the Stalingrad pocket requires eliminating German strongpoints that anchor the defensive perimeter, allowing Soviet infantry and armor to penetrate deep into the collapsing pocket. Traditional artillery can suppress these positions, but suppression allows Germans to take cover and survive until the barrage lifts. Katyusha salvos offer a different option: instantaneous saturation that destroys defensive positions faster than Germans can respond. Kusenko's battalion coordinates with 3 conventional artillery regiments, a fighter-bomber squadron flying Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmoviks, and 2 tank brigades preparing to exploit the breakthrough. The fire plan allocates each weapon system specific targets based on optimal effectiveness. Conventional 152mm howitzers will conduct counter-battery fires against identified German artillery positions. The Sturmovik squadrons will suppress German infantry reserves in the second defensive line. The Katyushas will deliver saturation bombardment against the primary defensive positions occupying fortified buildings and bunker complexes in the village of Marinovka, the strong point anchoring the northern sector of the German perimeter. The synchronized attack begins at 0600 hours with conventional artillery opening the bombardment. Kusenko watches through binoculars as 152mm shells impact German positions, their detonations throwing up frozen earth and structural debris. German defensive fires respond within minutes, machine gun tracers and mortar rounds impacting Soviet forward positions. The Germans are alert, disciplined, and fighting with the desperation of men who know no relief is coming. For 3 months, they've held Stalingrad despite impossible odds, believing Hitler's promises of reinforcement and breakout. Now, in January 1943, those illusions have died, but the soldiers continue fighting, because surrender to the Soviets seems a fate worse than death. At 0615 hours, Kusenko receives the fire command. His battalion's 36 launchers will fire in sequence, 3 batteries of 12 launchers each, staggered at 10-second intervals to maintain continuous rocket impact on the target area for approximately 30 seconds. The tactic represents refined Katyusha employment doctrine developed through 2 years of combat experience. Rather than firing all launchers simultaneously for maximum psychological shock, staggered firing prolongs the bombardment, preventing Germans from emerging from cover between salvos, and allows battery commanders to adjust impact points if initial rockets reveal better target coordinates.
Battery 1 fires first. 192 M13 rockets scream across the frozen landscape, their white smoke trails drawing perfect parabolas against the gray winter sky. Kosenko counts impacts, watching the village of Marinovka disappear behind a wall of high explosive detonations that collapse buildings, obliterate bunker positions, and ignite secondary explosions as German ammunition stores cook off. Before the last Battery 1 rocket's impact, Battery 2 fires its 192 rocket salvo, maintaining the continuous bombardment. Battery 3 follows 10 seconds later. In 30 seconds, 576 rockets delivering approximately 2,800 kilograms of high-explosive saturated target area measuring roughly 400 meters by 200 meters.
The Soviet tank brigades begin their assault before the rocket explosions stop echoing across the frozen steppe. T-34 tanks advance through the impact zone, their crews trained to exploit Katyusha barrages by attacking while enemy defenders are still stunned and disorganized. German defensive fires are sporadic and uncoordinated. Individual soldiers firing rifles from scattered positions rather than organized machine gun crews delivering interlocking fires. The strong point that had anchored the German defensive line for 2 months falls within 40 minutes of the initial Katyusha barrage. Kosenko's battalion displaces immediately after firing, following the tactical doctrine that has kept Guards mortar units alive despite German efforts to destroy them. The ZIS-6 trucks drive 8 kilometers to a secondary firing position, where ammunition trucks wait with reloads. The manual reloading process takes 35 minutes per launcher, crews climbing on the launch rails to manhandle 92-pound rockets into position, then connecting the electrical firing systems to each rocket's igniter. During reloading, the battalion is vulnerable to German air attack or artillery strikes, but by January 1943, German air power in the Stalingrad sector has been reduced to token resistance. The Luftwaffe squadrons that dominated Soviet skies in 1941 now struggle to maintain a dozen operational aircraft, their effectiveness destroyed by attrition, fuel shortages, and overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority. The pattern repeats across the Stalingrad encirclement during the final 2 weeks of January 1943. Katyusha batteries support Soviet infantry assaults, armor breakthroughs, and the systematic compression of the German pocket into smaller and smaller defensive perimeters. The psychological effect on trapped German soldiers combines with the physical destruction of their defensive positions, supply dumps, and command posts. Survivors later describe a sense of helplessness unlike anything experienced during the earlier stages of the war, the knowledge that Soviet firepower can strike anywhere within the pocket at any time, and that German countermeasures are completely ineffective. The Katyusha's role in the Stalingrad victory earns Guards mortar units commendations and recognition throughout the Red Army. More importantly, the battle validates Soviet tactical doctrine that integrates rocket artillery into combined arms operations as a standard component rather than specialized weapon. By mid-1943, as Soviet forces prepare for the Battle of Kursk, Katyusha deployment has become routine across all fronts. The weapon that terrorized Germans through psychological shock in 1941 has evolved into a systematic tool for destroying enemy defensive positions, disrupting offensive operations, and enabling Soviet tactical breakthrough operations. German military analysts studying captured Soviet tactical manuals recognize they're facing a fundamental transformation in how the Red Army conducts warfare. The disorganized, poorly led Soviet forces that retreated in chaos in 1941 have developed into a sophisticated military machine that combines overwhelming numbers with tactical innovation and industrial capacity. The Katyusha exemplifies this transformation. A weapon system that began as an experimental response to crisis has become a symbol of Soviet military revival and German strategic defeat.
April 16, 1945. Salvo Heights, 70 kilometers east of Berlin. The final battle begins with the largest artillery bombardment in human history. Over 9,000 Soviet guns and rocket launchers prepare to support Marshal Georgy Zhukov's assault across the Oder River toward the Nazi capital. Among those weapons, 1,500 Katyusha launchers from multiple Guards mortar divisions occupy concealed firing positions stretching across a 40-kilometer front. The weapon that started as 7 experimental launchers commanded by Captain Flyorov in July 1941 has evolved into a strategic system capable of delivering over 24,000 rockets in a single coordinated salvo. The bombardment begins at 0300 hours with a precision that reflects 4 years of tactical refinement. Conventional artillery conducts counter-battery fires against identified German gun positions. Heavy howitzers target German command posts and communication centers, and the Katyushas deliver saturation bombardment across the entire German defensive line, transforming the Silo Heights into an inferno of high explosive that German survivors later describe as the end of the world rendered in fire and steel. Senior Sergeant Viktor Kosenko, now a Guards Mortar Battalion commander after surviving 3 years of continuous combat from Stalingrad to Berlin, coordinates his 36 launchers in the pre-dawn darkness. His battalion will fire 3 complete salvos over 45 minutes, displacing between each firing to avoid German counter-battery strikes that never materialize. The Wehrmacht artillery that dominated European battlefields in 1939 has been systematically destroyed through 4 years of attrition warfare. German guns that might have retaliated against Soviet rocket positions have been knocked out by preliminary counter-battery fires or lack the ammunition to sustain defensive fires. The Katyusha salvos create effects that transcend traditional military metrics. The physical damage, bunkers collapsed, trenches obliterated, communications severed, represents only part of their impact. The psychological effect on German defenders manifests as complete organizational breakdown. Wehrmacht units that might have conducted organized tactical withdrawals instead dissolve into individual soldiers fleeing toward Berlin, abandoning weapons, equipment, and any pretense of military cohesion. Officers lose control of their formations not because soldiers refuse orders, but because the survivors are so psychologically traumatized that they've ceased functioning as military units. German casualties at Salo Heights exceed 12,000 killed in the first 24 hours, with thousands more captured when Soviet armor exploits breakthroughs created by the artillery bombardment. Post-battle interrogations reveal a consistent pattern. German soldiers describing the Katyusha barrages as more terrifying than any experience during the previous 6 years of warfare. One captured German major from the 9th Parachute Division articulates what many survivors struggle to express. "We fought across Poland, France, Russia, and back to Germany. We endured artillery barrages at Stalingrad, tank assaults at Kursk, and air attacks throughout the retreat. Nothing compared to Stalin's organ. The sound alone destroys your ability to think rationally. Then the rockets arrive and your world becomes fire and explosion. If you survive, you're no longer a soldier. You're a traumatized human being who'll do anything to escape that nightmare."
The Katyusha's evolution from experimental weapon to strategic system exemplifies Soviet adaptation during the Great Patriotic War. The weapon's technical specifications remained relatively unchanged from 1941 to 1945. BM-13 launchers still fired the same M13 rockets at similar ranges and with comparable accuracy. What transformed was Soviet doctrine for employing rocket artillery as an integrated component of combined arms operations. By 1945, Katyusha batteries coordinate with conventional artillery, air support, armor formations, and infantry assaults through sophisticated fire planning that maximizes the weapon's psychological and material effects while minimizing its vulnerabilities. The production statistics tell their own story of Soviet industrial mobilization. From 7 experimental launchers in July 1941, Soviet factories delivered over 10,000 Katyusha systems by war's end, firing approximately 12 million rockets that delivered roughly 58,000 tons of high explosive against German forces. The industrial commitment to rocket artillery represents a strategic choice. Soviet planners could have allocated those resources to conventional guns or tanks, but recognized that Katyusha's psychological impact multiplied its material effectiveness in ways that justified the investment. The weapon's psychological legacy extends beyond immediate battlefield effects.
Post-war studies of German veterans reveal that Katyusha experiences created lasting trauma that exceeded combat stress from other weapon systems. The distinctive sound of the rockets, combined with the instantaneous saturation bombardment, produced fear responses that Wehrmacht soldiers internalized as existential threat rather than tactical hazard. Veterans who'd adapted to artillery barrages, tank attacks, and airstrikes never fully adapted to Katyusha assaults. Each encounter recreated the same paralyzing terror regardless of how many times they'd survived previous attacks. Soviet military theorists studying the weapon's effectiveness identified key factors that made Katyusha exceptionally psychologically damaging. First, the distinctive sound created anticipatory fear. Soldiers heard the rockets coming but couldn't judge exact impact points, creating uncertainty that maximized stress. Second, the instantaneous delivery of massive payload eliminated the gradual exposure that allows soldiers to adapt to conventional artillery. Third, the weapon's unpredictability. Katyusha batteries could appear anywhere, strike without warning, then disappear, prevented Germans from developing effective countermeasures or safe zones. The Katyusha's nickname, Stalin's organ, achieved a cultural permanence that transcended its military function. Post-war Soviet propaganda celebrated the weapon as a symbol of technological achievement and military superiority. Monuments featuring Katyusha launchers appeared in cities across the Soviet Union, commemorating the weapon's role in defeating Nazi Germany. The popular song Katyusha, about a young woman waiting for her soldier to return from the front, became associated with the rocket launcher despite having no direct lyrical connection, cementing the weapon's place in Soviet cultural memory.
The Katyusha's evolution from experimental weapon to strategic system exemplifies Soviet adaptation during the Great Patriotic War. The weapon's technical specifications remained relatively unchanged from 1941 to 1945. BM-13 launchers still fired the same M13 rockets at similar ranges and with comparable accuracy. What transformed was Soviet doctrine for employing rocket artillery as an integrated component of combined arms operations. By 1945, Katyusha batteries coordinated with conventional artillery, air support, armor formations, and infantry assaults through sophisticated fire planning that maximized the weapon's psychological and material effects while minimizing its vulnerabilities. The production statistics tell their own story of Soviet industrial mobilization. From 7 experimental launchers in July 1941, Soviet factories delivered over 10,000 Katyusha systems by war's end, firing approximately 12 million rockets that delivered roughly 58,000 tons of high explosive against German forces. The industrial commitment to rocket artillery represents a strategic choice. Soviet planners could have allocated those resources to conventional guns or tanks, but recognized that Katyusha's psychological impact multiplied its material effectiveness in ways that justified the investment. The weapon's psychological legacy extends beyond immediate battlefield effects. Post-war studies of German veterans reveal that Katyusha experiences created lasting trauma that exceeded combat stress from other weapon systems. The distinctive sound of the rockets, combined with the instantaneous saturation bombardment, produced fear responses that Wehrmacht soldiers internalized as existential threat rather than tactical hazard. Veterans who'd adapted to artillery barrages, tank attacks, and airstrikes never fully adapted to Katyusha assaults. Each encounter recreated the same paralyzing terror, regardless of how many times they'd survived previous attacks. Soviet military theorists studying the weapon's effectiveness identified key factors that made Katyusha exceptionally psychologically damaging. First, the distinctive sound created anticipatory fear. Soldiers heard the rockets coming but couldn't judge exact impact points, creating uncertainty that maximized stress. Second, the instantaneous delivery of massive payload eliminated the gradual exposure that allows soldiers to adapt to conventional artillery. Third, the weapon's unpredictability.
Katyusha batteries could appear anywhere, strike without warning, then disappear, prevented Germans from developing effective countermeasures or safe zones. The Katyusha's nickname, Stalin's organ, achieved a cultural permanence that transcended its military function. Post-war Soviet propaganda celebrated the weapon as a symbol of technological achievement and military superiority. Monuments featuring Katyusha launchers appeared in cities across the Soviet Union, commemorating the weapon's role in defeating Nazi Germany. The popular song Katyusha, about a young woman waiting for her soldier to return from the front, became associated with the rocket launcher, despite having no direct lyrical connection, cementing the weapon's place in Soviet cultural memory.
For German forces, the Katyusha represented a technological and psychological defeat that challenged their assumptions about military superiority. The weapon demonstrated that Soviet industrial capacity and tactical innovation could match or exceed German capabilities. More fundamentally, it proved that the Wehrmacht soldiers, supposedly the most disciplined and combat-effective troops in the world, could be terrorized into psychological breakdown by weapons that exploited fear as effectively as they delivered explosive payload. By the time Soviet forces captured Berlin in May 1945, the Katyusha had evolved from experimental weapon to legendary symbol of Soviet military power. The 7 launchers that attacked Orsha railway station in July 1941 had multiplied into thousands of systems that delivered coordinated barrages in support of strategic offensive operations. The weapon that once served as desperate defensive expedient had become an offensive tool that enabled Soviet victory across a front stretching from Leningrad to the Black Sea. Captain Ivan Flyorov, who commanded that first experimental battery, never lived to see the weapon's ultimate triumph. His battery was surrounded by German forces in July 1941, and Flyorov executed his NKVD orders, destroying the launchers with thermite charges, then fighting to the death rather than allowing the weapons to be captured. But his tactical employment of rocket artillery at Orsha established doctrines that Soviet commanders refined and expanded throughout the war. The psychological impact he observed in those first German encounters became a weapon in itself, as important as the rocket's explosive payload. The German soldier who froze in terror hearing that distinctive scream at Orsha railway station in July 1941 experienced the same primal fear as his successor standing in Berlin's ruins in April 1945. The weapon changed, the tactical employment evolved, the scale increased from 7 launchers to thousands, but the psychological core remained constant. Stalin's organ played its death song, and German troops listened with the same helpless terror that no amount of combat experience could overcome.